Stumont, Belgium, December 17, 1944. The world had shrunk to the circular view through his commander's scope. Captain Jack Steele Mason's breath created small clouds of vapor inside the Sherman tank's turret as he scanned the tree line. The winter wind howled outside, but inside the metal beast, the only sounds were the soft, mechanical clicks of the gun, elevation mechanism, and the nervous breathing of his crew. 3 minutes. That was all they had before the German column would appear around the bend. Intelligence had been clear about that much at least. "Distance to target zone?" Mason asked, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. 800 yards, Captain," replied Sergeant Mike Romano, the gunner whose Brooklyn accent had never faded despite years in the Army. Mason adjusted his position, the cold metal of the commander's seat creaking beneath him. His calloused hands, the hands of a man who had grown up tinkering with engines in Detroit, gripped the rubber eyepiece of the periscope. Through it, he watched the snow-covered road that disappeared into the dense Ardennes forest. "They don't know this is their last day," Mason whispered, a statement that hung in the freezing air. "Maybe ours too." The radio crackled. "Steel 6, this is Steel 2. We're in position at the railway crossing. Over." "Steel 3 in position behind the station house. Over." Mason keyed his throat mic. "Understood. Hold until my command. Remember, aim for the lead tank first. We knock that one out. We create a roadblock for the rest." 3 Sherman tanks against the might of the German 1st SS Panzer Division. The odds were worse than poor. They were suicide. But sometimes suicide was all that stood between the enemy and victory. Mason checked his watch. 2 minutes now. He glanced at the photo taped to his instrument panel. A smiling young woman with dark hair and a factory worker's bandana. Eleanor, back in Michigan, probably working the assembly line at the tank plant. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Prepare for contact," Mason ordered. "Texas, engine idle. Chief, radio silence from now. Doc, load armor piercing." A series of affirmations came back as his crew prepared for battle. These men from across America, brought together in a steel coffin, were the best the nation had to offer. Mason knew every one of them would die before retreating. It wasn't just duty, it was something deeper, something uniquely American. The rumble came first, a distant vibration that Mason felt through the tank's hull before he heard it. His trained ear recognized the distinct sound of German Maybach engines. Panther tanks, at least 4 of them, maybe more. "They're coming," he said, feeling time slow around him. "Remember your training. Remember Detroit." As the first German tank rounded the bend, Mason whispered, "For Dad." Detroit, Michigan, 1927. The smell of motor oil and hot metal filled the cramped garage behind the modest home on Lafayette Street. 5-year-old Jack Mason watched with wide eyes as his father's muscular arms disappeared into the engine block of a Model T. "Hand me the 3/4 wrench, Jackie," James Mason said without looking up. Young Jack searched through the tools laid out on a clean rag, selecting the correct wrench with surprising certainty for a child his age. His father nodded approvingly as he took it. "You got a good eye, son, an engineer's eye." Jack beamed at the praise. To him, his father was a magician who could make any machine obey his commands. James Mason had worked at the Ford plant since returning from the Great War, his expertise with engines earning him a reputation as the man who could fix the unfixable. "Will you teach me about engines, Dad?" Jack asked, standing on tiptoe to peer into the mechanical heart of the vehicle. James Mason wiped his hands on a rag and lifted his son onto a stool. "I'll teach you everything I know, Jackie. In America, a man who understands machines will never go hungry." He pointed to the various components, explaining each with patience and precision. "See how everything works together? Every part has a purpose. Nothing wasted, nothing extra. That's good engineering." Over the next 5 years, the garage became Jack's classroom. While other boys played baseball in vacant lots, Jack learned to disassemble carburetors, rebuild transmissions, and diagnose engine problems by ear alone. By age 10, he could name every part in a vehicle and explain its function. Then came the day that divided his life into before and after. His mother's funeral was held on a rainy Tuesday. Tuberculosis had taken her quickly, too quickly for the doctors to intervene. Jack stood beside his father at the graveside, both in ill-fitting black suits, as the minister spoke words that meant nothing to a grieving child. That night, his father disappeared into the garage. Jack found him sitting on an overturned crate, staring at a half-dismantled engine, a bottle of whiskey at his feet. "Life's like an engine, just check," his father read, his voice rough with emotion. "Sometimes parts break. We fix what we can, replace what we can't, and keep moving forward. The Depression hit Detroit like a hammer. The automobile factory slowed production, and workers were laid off by the thousands. James Mason kept his job, but only by accepting longer hours for less pay. Jack often saw him return home with bloodied knuckles and exhausted eyes. By 1935, things began to change. War was brewing in Europe, and America was preparing, even if most citizens didn't realize it yet. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant broke ground in Warren, Michigan, and James Mason was among the first hired, his expertise with engines deemed essential to national security. At 14, Jack began accompanying his father to the plant during school holidays. The massive factory floor, filled with the cacophony of industrial production, became his second home. Here, the most powerful machines in history were taking shape. M3 Lee tanks, followed by the improved M4 Sherman. "This is the future of warfare, Jackie," his father explained as they gazed at the assembly line. "These tanks will win the next war. American engineering, American steel, American courage inside them." Jack ran his hand along the curved armor of a Sherman hull. "It's beautiful," he whispered. Feeling the cool metal beneath his palm, his father laughed. "Most boys your age think airplanes are beautiful, or battleships. But you see the beauty in these beasts. That's because you understand them." In the evenings, James Mason brought home technical manuals and blueprints, spreading them across the kitchen table. Together, father and son studied the mechanics of tank warfare, discussing improvements to engine cooling systems and turret rotation mechanisms. Jack absorbed it all, his mind categorizing and connecting concepts with natural ease. Everything changed again in the winter of 1942. An industrial accident at the tank plant claimed James Mason's life. A slipped chain, a multi-ton turret assembly falling. It was over in seconds. Jack, now 16, stood alone at another graveside, this time in bitter cold that matched the emptiness inside him. The plant manager attended, along with dozens of workers who had respected the senior Mason. They spoke of his contributions to the war effort, how the tanks he helped build were already making a difference in North Africa. That night, Jack sat in the garage, now silent without his father's presence. On the workbench lay his father's tools, meticulously organized. Beside them, an envelope containing his final paycheck and a letter expressing the company's condolences. Jack opened the toolbox and removed a heavy wrench. His father's hands had worn smooth spots in the metal over years of use. He gripped it tightly, feeling a connection to the man who had taught him everything. "I'll fix what I can," he whispered, echoing his father's words from years before, "and keep moving forward." His decision was made before morning came. America was at war, and Jack Mason would not sit on the sidelines. Fort Knox, Kentucky, 1943. Mason explained the difference between the 75mm and 76mm gun. Drill Sergeant Harkness's voice cut through the humid Kentucky air like artillery fire. Jack Mason stood at attention beside a Sherman tank, its engine ticking as it cooled in the afternoon sun. "The 76mm offers better penetration against German armor, Sergeant. The muzzle velocity is higher, allowing the round to pierce Panther frontal armor at combat ranges. The 75mm is effective against infantry and light armor, but struggles against heavier German tanks." Harkness circled him like a predator. "And why are we still using the 75 in most of our tanks, Private?" Mason swallowed hard. "Production priorities, Sergeant. The 76 requires different turret configurations and manufacturing changes. The Army decided quantity over quality would win the war." The drill sergeant's face remained impassive, but a flicker of approval crossed his eyes. "At least one of you understands what you're getting into," he muttered, then raised his voice. 3-mile run in full gear, now." As the tank trainees began their punishing run around the training grounds, Mason kept pace at the front of Vermont. Basic training had been grueling, but tank school was different. Here, mental agility was as important as physical strength. Every day brought new technical challenges, mechanical problems to solve, tactics to master. Mason had enlisted using forged documents that added 2 years to his age. At 17, he was still the youngest in his class, but his lifetime of mechanical education made him a natural tank operator. While others struggled with the complexities of the Sherman systems, Mason intuitively understood the machine's strengths and weaknesses. In the barracks that evening, Mason lay on his bunk, studying the tank manual by flashlight after lights out. The diagrams were familiar now, but he reviewed them obsessively. Knowledge meant survival. "You're going to wear out those pages, Mason," whispered his bunkmate, a former tractor mechanic from Nebraska. Better to wear out pages than get killed because I missed something, Mason replied without looking up. The next day brought unexpected news. The training company had assembled on the parade ground when the commanding officer appeared with a visitor. The newcomer wore the insignia of the 740th Tank Battalion, a unit Mason had never heard of. "We need volunteers for a special assignment," the visitor announced. "Men with exceptional mechanical aptitude and problem-solving skills. You'll be working with experimental equipment that could change the course of the war." Several soldiers raised their hands. Mason hesitated. He'd been slated for deployment to the Pacific, where American tanks were battling Japanese forces on island beaches. It was what he'd expected. "Private Mason," the training commander called out, "you've scored highest on the technical assessments. Step forward." Mason complied, standing at attention before the visitor. "I've reviewed your file," the officer said. "Your understanding of tank mechanics is remarkable, especially for someone so young." The emphasis on the last word made Mason's heart skip. Had they discovered his true age? "Thank you, sir," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "Your instructors say you can identify tank types by engine sound alone. Is that true?" Mason nodded. "Yes, sir. German Maybach engines have a distinctive rhythm, different from our continental radials. The Soviet diesel tanks have another sound entirely." The visitor exchanged looks with the training commander. "You're exactly what we're looking for. Report to administration for the transfer papers. You're joining the 740th. 2 weeks later, Mason found himself on a transport ship bound for England. The 740th Tank Battalion had been formed for a top-secret program called Canal Defense Light, using tanks modified with powerful searchlights to blind enemy forces during night operations. The concept had proven less effective than hoped, and now the unit was being converted to a standard medium tank battalion. What made the 740th unique was its status as a separate tank battalion, not permanently attached to any specific infantry division. They could be assigned wherever needed, a mobile reserve of armored firepower. During the Atlantic crossing, Mason was promoted to sergeant and assigned as a tank commander, responsibility that normally went to men years his senior. His technical knowledge and natural leadership had impressed his superiors, despite his youth. On the ship, he met the men who would form his crew, each specialist bringing different skills to their collective mission. Sergeant Mike Doc Romano had been a medical student before the war. The Brooklyn native had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, his analytical mind making him an ideal gunner. His ability to calculate range, wind drift, and ballistic trajectories without computational aids seemed almost supernatural. "I was going to be a surgeon," Romano explained as they shared cigarettes on the deck one night. "Steady hands, good eye. Same skills apply to putting a shell through a German tank at 1,000 yards. Corporal Samuel Texas Williams had been racing stock cars since before he could legally drive. The lanky southerner from San Antonio could handle any vehicle with wheels or tracks, pushing machines beyond what their designers thought possible. "Ain't no different than dirt track racing," Williams drawled when asked about maneuvering a 30-ton tank in combat. "Except the other fellows are trying to blow you up instead of just pass you." Private First Class Benjamin Bookworm Cohen was the intellectual of the group. A physics student from Boston with a photographic memory, he could recite ammunition load data and armor penetration values for every tank in the European theater. As loader, his efficiency and precision kept their rate of fire higher than any other crew in the battalion. "The mathematics of ballistics is simple," Cohen would say. "It's the application under stress that separates theory from practice." Specialist Ray Chief Running Bear completed the team as radio operator and assistant driver. A Navajo from Arizona with exceptional hearing, he could discern enemy tank movements through ground vibrations and identify aircraft by engine noise before they appeared. "My grandfather could track a deer for days by listening to the forest," Running Bear said quietly. "I listened to the battlefield the same way." Together, they formed a microcosm of America itself. Different backgrounds, different skills, united by common purpose. Mason saw in them the strength of his country, not uniformity, but unity through diversity. As the transport ship approached the English coast, Mason gathered his crew on deck. "When we land, we become a single organism," he told them. 5 men, 1 machine. We trust each other with our lives. We fight not just for our country, but for each other." They nodded solemnly. Words were unnecessary among men headed to war. Neuchâtel, Belgium, November 1944. The rain had fallen continuously for 3 days, turning the small Belgian town into a morass of mud and standing water. Mason stood in the town square watching as locals hurried about their business, casting curious glances at the American tanks parked under camouflage netting, or rather, where tanks should have been. The 740th Tank Battalion had arrived in Europe with men, equipment, tools, and determination. What they lacked were actual tanks, a supply oversight that seemed impossible in an army known for its logistics prowess. Lieutenant Colonel George Marshall, the battalion commander, emerged from the headquarters building, his expression stormy. Mason and the other tank commanders gathered around. First Army says we're not in their deployment schedule, Marshall announced. According to headquarters, we don't officially exist yet. What about our tanks, sir? Asked one of the officers. They've promised us two Sherman tanks for an entire battalion. Marshall's frustration was palpable. In the meantime, we're to maintain order in New Chateau and continue training, as if you can train tankers without tanks. The men dispersed, disappointment evident in their postures. Mason returned to his crew, who waited expectantly. We're on police duty, he informed them, keeping the peace in town while the real war happens elsewhere. Police duty? Williams spat. I didn't cross an ocean to direct traffic. Orders are orders, Texas, Mason replied, though he shared the sentiment. They had trained to fight, not to patrol streets. The weeks that followed established a routine. The battalion maintained security in New Chateau, enforcing curfew, managing civilian traffic, and occasionally breaking up disputes between locals and soldiers from other units passing through. One night, Williams was on patrol when he encountered a young Belgian woman walking alone after curfew. Ma'am, you need to be indoors, he called out in his limited French. Hospital, she replied urgently. I must go to hospital. When Williams insisted she return home, she opened her coat to reveal her advanced pregnancy. Without hesitation, he escorted her to the town's small medical facility. The woman delivered a healthy boy that night, with Williams waiting nervously in the corridor. The story spread through the battalion, a rare moment of joy amidst the frustration of inaction. Marshall awarded Williams a commendation for his compassion, though the Texan brushed it off as just being decent. December brought bitter cold to the Ardennes. The temperature plummeted, freezing the mud into treacherous ridges. Snow began to fall, transforming the landscape into a monochrome wasteland. The men of the 740th huddled in their billets, rotating through guard duty in the frigid air. Mason spent his free time studying German tank tactics, particularly those of the elite Panzer divisions. He obtained technical manuals, interrogation reports, and battlefield assessments, building a comprehensive understanding of their potential adversaries. You're obsessed, Captain, Romano commented, finding Mason poring over documents by lamplight. Knowledge is armor, Mason replied. The Germans have better tanks than we do. Their Panthers and Tigers outgun and out-armor our Shermans. But they're not invincible. Every machine has weaknesses. We just need to find them. The morning of December 16th began like any other. Mason awoke before dawn, performed his daily calisthenics, and prepared for another day of waiting. Then the distant thunder began. Not weather, but artillery, massive bombardment to the east. By midday, reports were flooding in. The Germans had launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest. The thin American lines had broken in multiple places. Panzer divisions were driving west, creating chaos and confusion. Marshall called an emergency meeting of all officers. This is it, gentlemen, he had announced, his earlier frustration replaced by grim determination. First Army has changed their tune. Now they need every tank they can get. We're ordered to proceed to Ordnance Depot 5 and requisition whatever vehicles they have available, then move to defensive positions. A captain raised his hand. What about our assigned tanks, sir? Forget the paperwork. We take what we can get and we fight. The Germans are throwing everything into this offensive. Intelligence says it's the 1st SS Panzer Division leading the attack. A murmur ran through the assembled officers. The 1st SS Leibstandarte was Hitler's personal bodyguard unit, fanatically loyal and exceptionally well-equipped. Veterans of the Eastern Front, they had earned the nickname Blowtorch Battalion for their practice of burning everything in their path. One more thing, Marshall added. Reports indicate the SS have been executing prisoners. The Malmedy massacre, over 90 American POWs shot in cold blood. He let the information sink in. Remember that when you face them. The battalion mobilized with practiced efficiency. Trucks rolled toward the ordnance depot, each crew prepared to take whatever they could find. What they discovered was disheartening. The depot contained tanks, but most were battle-damaged returns from the front lines. Hulks with blown tracks, punctured armor, damaged gun systems. the detritus of previous battles, awaiting repair or salvage. "This is what we have to work with?" Williams asked, surveying the mechanical graveyard. Mason was already moving between the damaged Shermans, assessing each with a practiced eye. "We can make this work," he said. "This one has a functional drivetrain. That one has an intact turret assembly. We can combine parts." For the next 12 hours, the men of the 740th became battlefield engineers. Working with minimal tools and pure determination, they cobbled together functional tanks from the damaged remains. Mason's crew focused on a Sherman with turret damage, but a sound hull, transplanting a turret assembly from another vehicle. By nightfall, they had assembled 3 operational tanks. Not a full company, barely a platoon, but enough to make a stand. Marshall gathered their crews beside their reconstructed machines. "Intelligence reports the Germans are pushing towards Stumont. The railway station there is a critical junction. If they secure it, they'll have a straight path to Liege." He pointed to Mason. "Your 3 tanks will proceed to Stumont station immediately. Delay the enemy advance by any means necessary. The 30th Infantry Division is moving to reinforce, but you'll be on your own for at least 24 hours. Mason saluted, understanding the magnitude of the mission. 3 tanks against the spearhead of an SS Panzer Division, a suicide mission by any rational assessment. As they prepared to depart, Marshall pulled Mason aside. "I'm promoting you to captain, effective immediately. These men need a leader who understands what they're facing." "Thank you, sir," Mason replied, surprised by the battlefield promotion. "Don't thank me," Marshall said grimly. "I'm sending you into the mouth of hell." The journey to Stumont took place in darkness, the 3 Shermans moving without headlights through the snow-covered landscape. Mason rode with his head out of the turret despite the bitter cold, scanning the horizon for threats. Chief Running Bear sat beside him, listening intently. "Aircraft," Running Bear said suddenly, pointing southeast. Moments later, the distant drone of engines reached the rest of the crew. German reconnaissance planes searching for American movements. "Under cover," Mason ordered, directing Williams to steer their tank beneath a cluster of pine trees. The other tanks followed suit, their white-painted hulls blending with the snowy ground. They remained motionless until the aircraft passed. As they approached Stumont, Mason observed the terrain with a tactician's eye. The railway station sat at the bottom of a winding road, a perfect ambush position. If they placed their tanks correctly, they could create a fatal bottleneck for the German advance. "Texas, position us behind that stone wall," Mason directed. "Doc, calculate firing solutions for the road junction. Chief, radio the other tanks. I want Steel 2 at the railway crossing and Steel 3 behind the station house." The crew executed his orders with precision, born of endless drills. The Sherman's engine growled softly as Williams maneuvered it into position, then fell silent. In the darkness, Mason could see his breath forming clouds inside the turret. "Load armor piercing," he ordered. Cohen responded by slamming a shell into the breech with practiced efficiency. "Target range approximately 800 yards, Romano reported, adjusting his sights. Mason checked his watch. 3 hours until dawn. Intelligence suggested the German advance would reach Stumont by first light. "Get some rest," he told his crew. 2-hour rotation. I'll take first watch." As the others settled into uncomfortable positions, Mason remained at his observation post, scanning the road that disappeared into the forest. His thoughts turned to his father. What would James Mason think of his son now, commanding a tank in the desperate defense of Europe? Would he be proud, or horrified that his boy was facing death so far from home? Mason removed a worn photograph from his breast pocket. Eleanor Simmons, a girl from his Detroit neighborhood who now worked at the same tank plant where his father had died. They had exchanged letters throughout his training, her words a connection to normal life amid the insanity of war. "I'm assembling the tanks you'll use in Europe," she had written in her last letter. "Every rivet, every weld, I think of you and the other boys who'll depend on my work." Mason tucked the photo away. He wouldn't let her down. He wouldn't let any of them down. The hours passed slowly. Mason rotated the watch with his crew, each man alert despite their exhaustion. As the eastern sky began to lighten, Chief Running Bear, on final watch, stiffened. "Engines," he said simply. "Many engines." Mason was instantly alert, pressing his ear to the tank's hull. The vibration was unmistakable. German tanks, their Maybach engines producing a distinctive rhythm different from American power plants. "Battle stations," Mason ordered, his voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through him. "This is what we trained for. The crew moved with fluid efficiency, each man assuming his position. Williams at the driver's station, Running Bear beside him manning the bow machine gun and radio. Romano seated at the gunner's position, his eye pressed to the sight. Cohen ready at the loader's station, shells arranged for quick access. Mason keyed his throat mic. Steel 2, Steel 3. This is Steel 6. Enemy approaching from the east. Hold fire until my command. Acknowledgements crackled over the radio. 3 tanks, 15 men, standing between the German war machine and its objectives. The rumble grew louder. Through his periscope, Mason could see movement at the forest edge. The distinctive silhouette of a Panther tank emerged from the trees, followed by another and another. The German column was advancing cautiously, commanders visible in their turret hatches, scanning for threats. Range 700 yards and closing, Romano reported. Wait, Mason instructed. Let the sheet. Watching the lead tanks continue down the road. Let them commit to the approach. The Panthers advanced, their commanders apparently confident that the small Belgian town was undefended. As the lead tank reached the road junction, Mason gave the order that would echo through history. Fire! Romano squeezed the trigger. The Sherman 75mm gun roared, the tank rocking backward with the recoil. Through his sight, Mason watched the shell arc toward its target, praying for accuracy. The round struck the road just in front of the lead Panther, ricocheting upward to hit the thinner armor of the tank's underside. A perfect shot, exploiting one of the few vulnerabilities in the German design. The Panther erupted in flames, its ammunition igniting in a catastrophic detonation that threw its turret 30 feet into the air. Target destroyed, Romano shouted. Reload, Mason ordered, though Cohen was already ramming another shell into the breach. The German column had frozen in momentary confusion. Mason used that hesitation to target the second tank. Fire! The shell struck the Panther's gun mantlet, destroying the muzzle brake and rendering its main armament useless. The third Sherman engaged the next tank in line, scoring multiple hits that set it ablaze. In less than 2 minutes, 3 American tanks had destroyed or disabled the lead elements of the vaunted 1st SS Panzer Division. The road to Stumont was blocked by burning German armor. Back up and relocate, Mason commanded. They'll bring artillery on this position. Williams reversed the Sherman, moving it to a secondary firing position behind a stone farmhouse. Just in time, as German mortar rounds began falling where they had been moments before. The battle for Stumont had begun. 3 American tanks, cobbled together from damaged parts, had just become the cork in the bottle of Hitler's last great offensive. The odds remained overwhelming, but in those first moments of combat, Mason and his crew had accomplished the impossible. As the morning light illuminated the burning German tanks, Mason allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. His father would indeed be proud. They'll come again, he told his crew, watching German infantry deploying from half-tracks, and in greater numbers. But we've shown them Americans aren't to be underestimated. Romano checked his ammunition count. We've got 22 armor-piercing rounds left. Make them count. Mason nodded. Make them count, every single one. The radio crackled with a message from battalion headquarters. Marshall's voice filled with rare emotion. Steel 6, this is Hammer 6. First reports coming in. You've stopped the SS advance cold. The 30th Infantry is moving to support. Hold that position. History will remember this day. Mason acknowledged the transmission, then prepared his crew for the inevitable counterattack. The Battle of Stumont was just beginning, but in its opening moments, American courage and ingenuity had dealt a stunning blow to Nazi Germany's most elite forces. In the commander's seat of a patched-together Sherman tank, a young man from Detroit had found his destiny. Captain Jack Steele Mason would not know it for decades, but his actions on this December morning would indeed be remembered in the annals of armored warfare. The greatest tank battle of his life was just beginning. Stumont, Belgium, December 17, 1944. Midday. The second German attack came with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. No frantic rush this time, but a methodical advance under covering fire. Captain Jack Mason watched through his commander's scope as Panther tanks emerged from the forest edge, flanked by grenadiers in winter camouflage. The enemy had learned from their first costly mistake. 8 tanks, Mason counted, his voice steady despite the odds, plus mechanized infantry. They're spreading out to prevent a bottleneck. We can't stop that many, Cohen whispered, the loader's usual confidence wavering. Mason pressed his eye harder against the periscope. We're not trying to stop them. We're buying time. The radio crackled. Steel 2 reporting German infantry flanking their position. Steel 3 detecting tank movements on the western approach. The noose was tightening around their small force. New positions, Mason ordered. Texas, move us behind that stone building. Doc, I want you to target their command tank. Look for the one with the extra antennas. The Sherman's engine roared as Williams expertly reversed from their concealed position, then accelerated toward the sturdy structure of what had once been a granary. Stone walls 3 feet thick would provide temporary protection from German tank rounds. Chief, tell Steel 2 and 3 to reposition every 2 minutes. I want the Germans thinking they're facing a full company. Running Bear relayed the orders while simultaneously firing the bow machine gun at approaching infantry. The chatter of the .30 caliber cut through the deeper booms of tank cannons. Mason checked his watch. The 30th Infantry Division was still hours away. Their 3 tanks would have to hold back an armored battalion until then. Doc, do you have a shot? Mason asked. Romano's eye never left his sight. Affirmative, command tank identified, range 650 yards. Fire when ready. The Sherman's gun thundered. The shell arcing toward the Panther Mason had identified as the unit commander's vehicle. A direct hit on the turret ring where armor was thinnest. The German tank slewed sideways, its turret jammed in position, unable to traverse. Target damaged but operational, Romano reported. They're backing away. Good enough, Mason replied. Find me another target. For the next hour, the 3 American tanks engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse. Never staying in one position long enough for German artillery to zero in, they struck at the German formation's flanks, disabled 2 more Panthers, and inflicted casualties on the infantry. But the outcome was never in doubt. German numbers would eventually prevail. The question was only how long Mason's tanks could delay them. We're down to 7 AP rounds, Cohen reported after their latest engagement. Mason considered their options. Switch to high explosive, target their infantry and support vehicles. Without ground troops, their tanks will be vulnerable. The Sherman shuddered as a German shell struck nearby, showering the hull with dirt and stone fragments. Williams cursed but kept the tank moving, zigzagging between buildings to break the enemy's tracking. Steel 2 reports their hit, Running Bear announced. Track damage. They're immobilized near the church. Mason made a quick decision. Tell them to abandon if they can't repair within 5 minutes. Fall back to the sanatorium building on the hill. The St. Edward's Sanatorium stood on elevated ground overlooking Stumont, its stone walls and labyrinthine corridors ideal for defense. If they could reach it, they might be able to establish a stronger position. Steel 3 acknowledges they're moving to the sanatorium now, Running Bear confirmed. Mason tapped Williams on the shoulder. Texas, get us up that hill. Use the tree line for cover. The Sherman lurched forward, climbing the steep road toward the imposing structure. Behind them, German tanks were entering the town proper, methodically clearing buildings with machine gun fire and high explosive rounds. As they approached the sanatorium, Mason spotted Steel 3 already in position behind a low stone wall, its gun covering the approach road. Of Steel 2, there was no sign. Get me battalion, Mason ordered. Running Bear worked the radio, but only static answered his calls. The Germans were jamming their frequencies. The sanatorium loomed before them, a massive stone structure built in the previous century. Once a place of healing for tuberculosis patients seeking mountain air, it had been abandoned early in the war. Its windows were dark, its grounds overgrown. Position us at the northeast corner, Mason directed. We'll cover both approach roads from there. Williams maneuvered the Sherman into place, its gun facing down the hill toward the advancing Germans. In the distance, Mason could see Steel 2, immobilized in the town square, its crew nowhere in sight. He hoped they had escaped. We make our stand here, he told his crew. Use the building for protection. Only expose the turret when firing. The next German assault began with artillery. Shells rained down around the sanatorium, cratering the grounds and shattering windows. Mason ordered both tanks to back against the building walls, using the structure to shield them from direct hits. When the barrage lifted, Panther tanks advanced up the hill in a wedge formation, 5 metal Predators moving with synchronized precision. Behind them came half-tracks filled with infantry. Wait for my command, Mason instructed. Let them commit to the approach. The German tanks continued their advance, apparently unaware of the exact positions of the American armor. When the lead Panther was 300 yards away, Mason gave the order. Fire! Both Shermans opened up simultaneously. Romano's shot struck the lead Panther's drive wheel, immobilizing it in the middle of the road and creating an obstacle for the tanks behind. Steel 3 hit a half-track, which exploded in a fireball, scattering German infantry. The remaining Panthers returned fire, their 75mm shells striking the sanatorium walls with devastating force. Stone fragments filled the air as ancient masonry crumbled under the impact. "Back up," Mason ordered. Williams reversed the Sherman until its rear hull touched the building, leaving only the gun barrel exposed. For 2 hours, they held their position against repeated German assaults. The sanatorium grounds became a graveyard of burned vehicles and fallen soldiers. Both sides took losses, but the Germans could afford theirs. Mason's force was down to one operational tank besides his own, and ammunition was critically low. As dusk approached, Mason made a difficult decision. "We need to get inside the building. We're too exposed out here." "Inside?" Williams questioned. "Captain, we can't fit a Sherman through those doors. We're not taking the tank in. We're going to defend on foot." Mason keyed his radio, reaching Steel 3. "Disable your vehicle and join us inside the sanatorium. Bring all portable weapons and ammunition." The acknowledgement came back immediately. Mason turned to his crew. "Texas, position the tank to cover the main entrance. Remove the coaxial machine gun and as much ammunition as we can carry. Chief, grab the radio. Doc, bring the first aid kit and any rations. Cohen, I want the Thompson submachine gun and all grenades." His crew moved with practiced efficiency, stripping the tank of useful equipment. Mason fired a final high-explosive round into the nearest disabled Panther, ensuring it couldn't be recovered, then ordered Williams to jam the Sherman's controls. They wouldn't give the Germans a functional American tank. As night fell, they entered the sanatorium through a side door. The interior was cold and silent, dust covering abandoned medical equipment and furniture. Mason led his men through darkened corridors until they reached the central lobby, a 3-story atrium with balconies overlooking the main entrance. "Perfect defensive position," Mason noted. "We can cover all approaches from here." The crew from Steel 3 arrived minutes later, carrying additional weapons and equipment. Together, 10 men would now defend what 3 tanks couldn't hold. They established firing positions on the second-floor balcony, covering the main doors and first-floor windows. "They'll come again before dawn," Mason told the assembled men. "They need this road junction, and they'll throw everything at us to get it." He assigned watch rotations, ensuring half the men were alert at all times. In the brief respite, he examined a building directory on the wall, memorizing the layout. Knowledge of terrain was often the difference between victory and defeat. "Captain, you should see this," called Romano, who had been scouting the building's west wing. Mason followed him down a darkened corridor and into what had once been a storage area. Romano's flashlight illuminated the unexpected. A middle-aged man in priest clothing, standing protectively before a group of civilians huddled in the shadows. Mason counted at least 30 people, including several children. "Please," the priest said in accented English, "do not shoot. We are Belgian civilians." Mason lowered his weapon immediately. "You're safe. We're Americans." The priest relaxed slightly. "Father Matthias," he introduced himself. "When the Germans came, we hid here. They did not search thoroughly." Mason knelt beside a frightened young boy, no more than 6 years old. "Hello there," he said gently. "My name is Jack." The boy stared with wide eyes but didn't respond. His mother whispered, "He has not spoken since the bombs fell on our village." Standing, Mason addressed Father Matthias. "There will be fighting here soon. Is there a safer place in the building for these people?" The priest nodded. "The basement has a wine cellar with stone walls. Very strong." "Take them there," Mason ordered, "and stay quiet no matter what you hear." As the civilians gathered their meager possessions, a young woman approached Mason. Her advanced pregnancy was evident despite her attempt to conceal it with a loose coat. "My time is near," she said simply. "If the baby comes." Mason called for Romano. "Doc, this woman may go into labor. What can we do?" Romano's medical training was immediately evident in his calm assessment. "When did the contractions start, ma'am?" "This morning," she replied. Romano turned to Mason. "She needs to be in that cellar. I'll check on her when I can." Mason nodded, then addressed the entire group. "We'll protect you. The American infantry will be here by tomorrow. Just stay hidden until then." After the civilians were safely relocated to the basement, Mason returned to the main defensive position. The men had established machine gun nests covering the entrance and positioned riflemen on the upper floors. It wasn't a tank platoon anymore, but a makeshift infantry squad. "Status report," Mason requested. 2 bars, 3 Thompson submachine guns, 8 M1 rifles, and about 15 grenades between us, reported the sergeant from Steel 3, plus whatever pistols men are carrying. Ammunition? Enough for one good firefight, not much more. Mason considered their options. We don't need to defeat them, just hold them back until reinforcements arrive. Conserve ammunition, only shoot at confirmed targets. The night passed in tense silence. Occasionally they could hear German vehicles moving in the town below, but no attack materialized. Perhaps the enemy believed the sanatorium was still defended by tanks, or maybe they were regrouping for a major assault at dawn. Mason used the time to examine maps of the area, plotting potential routes for both German advance and American reinforcement. He marked likely artillery positions and tank deployment zones, preparing for all contingencies. Around 3 in the morning, Running Bear approached. Captain, radio signal, very faint. Mason followed him to their makeshift communications post. Through static and interference, he could make out fragments of an American transmission. The 30th Infantry Division was deploying forward elements. They would reach Stumont by noon. 9 more hours, Mason calculated. We can hold that long. He rejoined his men at the defensive positions. Cohen was distributing coffee made from powdered rations, a luxury that raised morale despite its bitter taste. Williams was cleaning his rifle methodically, the ritual bringing calm before battle. You know what's ironic, Williams said softly. Back home, I wanted to race cars after the war. Now I may never even drive again. You'll drive again, Mason assured him. Detroit's going to make the best cars in the world when this is over. You'll have your pick. Williams smiled. Maybe I'll build one myself, something fast, something that can't be shot at. The conversation died as Running Bear raised his hand for silence. His exceptional hearing had detected movement outside. Mason peered through a broken window. In the pre-dawn light, he could make out German infantry advancing toward the sanatorium in loose formation, using trees and terrain for cover. Behind them, 3 Panther tanks provided support. Here they come, Mason whispered. Hold fire until they reach the main entrance. The Germans approached cautiously, perhaps expecting an ambush. When they reached the sanatorium steps, a lieutenant signaled his men forward. The main doors were pushed open, and soldiers began to enter the darkened lobby. Mason waited until a full squad had entered before giving the command. Fire! The Americans opened up from their elevated positions, machine guns and rifles creating a devastating crossfire in the confined space. The first wave of Germans fell before they could return fire. Outside, the Panther tanks began shelling the building, their high explosive rounds punching through the upper floor windows and walls. Plaster and stone fragments filled the air as sections of ceiling collapsed. Hold position, Mason ordered, firing his Thompson at Germans attempting to flank through a side entrance. The .45 caliber rounds tore through winter uniforms, dropping 3 soldiers in quick succession. The battle for the sanatorium intensified as more German troops entered the building. Fighting spread to multiple floors as small teams of soldiers engaged in room-to-room combat. The Americans used their knowledge of the building's layout to ambush enemy squads, then fall back to new positions. Mason moved between defensive points, directing fire and redistributing ammunition as needed. His tank commander's training had never prepared him for infantry combat, but the principles remained the same. Use terrain, concentrate firepower, maintain mobility. By mid-morning, the situation had deteriorated. 3 Americans were dead, 4 more wounded. Ammunition was dangerously low, and the Germans controlled the first floor and parts of the second. Mason and his remaining men had established a final defensive perimeter on the 3rd floor. We need to buy more time, Mason told his surviving crew. They looked exhausted, faces blackened with gunpowder and dust, but determination still burned in their eyes. Romano checked his medical kit, now nearly empty after treating the wounded. The pregnant woman went into labor an hour ago, he reported. She's in the wine cellar with the others. Father Matthias is helping her. The news added urgency to their defense. Civilians depended on them holding this position. We got maybe 50 rounds left between us, Williams calculated. Not enough to hold another assault. Mason looked around the room, his tactical mind assessing every object for its defensive potential. His eyes settled on an abandoned medical cabinet. What were they treating here before the war? He asked. Cohen, with his encyclopedic knowledge, answered immediately. Tuberculosis primarily. This was a pulmonary sanatorium. So they would have had oxygen tanks, Mason reasoned. Pressurized cylinders. Understanding dawned on Williams' face. Improvised explosives. Exactly, Mason confirmed. Find me those tanks and any alcohol from the medical supplies. The men scattered, searching adjacent rooms. They returned with 4 oxygen cylinders and several bottles of medical alcohol. Under Mason's direction, They created improvised bombs using grenades as detonators. We'll place these at strategic points on the stairwells, Mason explained. When they make their push, we trigger them remotely. The blast and fire should slow them down. As they finished preparations, the distinctive sound of Panther engines grew louder. Through a shattered window, Mason saw 5 tanks approaching the sanatorium, accompanied by at least a company of infantry. This is their major push, he warned. Get ready. The German attack began with renewed artillery bombardment. Shells struck the upper floors, collapsing sections of roof and walls. Through the case, German assault teams entered the building, moving methodically toward the American position. Mason deployed his men in a semicircle, covering all approaches to their position. When the first German squad appeared on the stairwell, he detonated one of the improvised explosives. The blast shook the building, filling the stairwell with fire and debris, temporarily blocking that approach. But the Germans simply redirected, finding alternative routes upward. The fighting became desperate, hand-to-hand in some corridors as ammunition ran critically low. Mason found himself facing a German officer in a brief, violent struggle. The SS lieutenant drew a knife, slashing at Mason's throat. Mason blocked with his rifle, then countered with a brutal stock strike to the German's face. As the officer fell, Mason captured his Luger pistol, gaining precious ammunition. The battle for St. Edward's Sanatorium had become a brutal test of wills. Both sides fighting room by room, yard by yard, neither willing to concede. But physics and mathematics remained immutable. The Germans had more men, more ammunition, more of everything needed to win a protracted fight. As Mason prepared to trigger their final improvised explosive, a new sound cut through the battlefield noise. The distinctive engine roar of American Sherman tanks, accompanied by the sharp crack of US 75mm guns. Running Bear, bleeding from a shoulder wound but still manning the radio, looked up with a grin. 30 Infantry Division, Captain. They're here. Mason moved to a window facing the town. American tanks were engaging the Panthers on the hillside, while infantry deployed in combat formation around the sanatorium perimeter. The German attack faltered as commanders reassessed the changed tactical situation. Within an hour, American troops had secured the building's lower floors. A lieutenant from the 30th Division found Mason and his surviving crew members barricaded in their third-floor position. Captain Mason, the officer asked, looking at the ragged, exhausted men. What's left of us? Mason confirmed, lowering his weapon. The lieutenant shook his head in amazement. Sir, your stand here is already being discussed at Division HQ. You held back an entire battle group of the 1st SS Panzer Division with just 3 tanks and then a handful of men. Mason looked at his surviving crew. Not just any men, the best tankers in the U.S. Army. As medical personnel arrived to treat the wounded, Mason descended to the basement to check on the civilians. He found Father Matthias beaming with pride despite his exhaustion. A boy, the priest announced, born during the worst of the fighting, yet he never cried, as if he knew to stay silent. The new mother lay on an improvised bed, her child swaddled in torn uniform shirts donated by American soldiers. She looked up as Mason approached. I am naming him Jacques, she said softly. After you. Mason felt a lump form in his throat. Amid the carnage and destruction, life had persisted. It seemed a perfect metaphor for why they fought this war at all. The next day brought reinforcements and resupply. The 30th Infantry Division had secured Stumont, pushing the Germans back several miles. But intelligence indicated the enemy was regrouping for another assault. The Battle of the Bulge was far from over. Mason received orders to return to battalion headquarters for debriefing. Before leaving, he gathered his surviving crew. I've requested we stay together, he informed them. Battalion is assigning us new tanks. We'll be back in the fight within 48 hours. Wouldn't have it any other way, Captain, Williams drawled. These Germans still don't know who they're dealing with. Mason nodded, pride swelling in his chest. No, they don't. But they're learning. The road back to headquarters took them through villages, already showing the scars of war. Bombed buildings, abandoned vehicles, hastily dug graves. The human cost of conflict written across the Belgian countryside. At Battalion HQ, Mason found Colonel Marshall coordinating the deployment of newly arrived replacement tanks. The commander looked up as Mason entered the command post, a converted farmhouse now bustling with radio operators and intelligence officers. The Lion of Stumont returns, Marshall greeted him, using a nickname Mason hadn't heard before. Just doing our job, sir, Mason replied. Marshall motioned him to a private corner. Your stand at the sanatorium bought critical time for our defenses to organize. The Germans lost their momentum because of you and your men. We had help, sir. The locals. There were civilians hiding in the building. I know. They've been evacuated to safety. Marshall consulted a clipboard. I've put you in for a silver star. The rest of your crew for bronze stars. Mason nodded his appreciation. Thank you, sir, but what we really need are new tanks. Already arranged. 5 brand new Shermans with 76mm guns. The improved models. Marshall smiled at Mason's surprised expression. When a crew accomplishes what yours did, they get the best equipment available. 5 tanks. Enough for a full platoon. Mason felt the weight of increased responsibility, but also satisfaction. His makeshift force was growing into something more formidable. There's something else, Marshall continued. Intelligence reports the 82nd Airborne Division is deploying to our sector. We'll be providing tank support for their operations. The 82nd Airborne, the elite of American infantry, paratroopers known for taking on the most dangerous missions. Mason had heard stories of their exploits since Sicily and Normandy. When do we link up with them, he asked. Tomorrow. They're moving into defensive positions along the northern shoulder of the German advance. Marshall pointed to a map on the wall. We need to hold this line at all costs. If the Germans break through here, they could reach Antwerp and split the Allied armies. Mason studied the map, noting terrain features and key road junctions. The tactical situation was precarious. The Germans had achieved surprise with their offensive and were exploiting initial gains. Only desperate stands like the one at Stumont had prevented a complete breakthrough. We'll be ready, sir, Mason assured him. I know you will. Get us some rest while you can. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. Mason saluted and departed, finding his crew at the mess tent. They sat together at a corner table, the shared experience of combat creating a bond stronger than any formal military structure. New tanks, he announced as he joined them, 76mm guns, and were being expanded to a full platoon. Williams whistled appreciatively. About time they gave us the good stuff. We're also being attached to the 82nd Airborne, Mason continued, providing armor support for their operations. Romano looked up from his coffee. The All-Americans? Those guys are crazy. They jump out of perfectly good airplanes. And they're the best infantry in the European theater, Mason replied. We'll be working with the best now. Cohen, still bandaged from wounds received at the sanatorium, asked the question on everyone's mind. What's our next mission, Captain? Defensive positions, northern sector. We're helping hold the line against further German advances. Running Bear, quiet as always, finally spoke. The weather is changing. I can feel it. Mason had learned to trust the Navajo's almost supernatural connection to natural elements. Changing how? Clearing. The sky will open soon. The significance wasn't lost on anyone at the table. Since the beginning of the German offensive, heavy cloud cover had grounded Allied aircraft. The Luftwaffe had been able to operate with reduced fear of P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoon fighter bombers hunting their tanks. If the skies cleared, American air superiority would return, changing the equation dramatically. That's the best news I've heard all day, Mason said, clapping Running Bear on the shoulder. The next morning brought their new tanks. The Sherman M4A3E8, known colloquially as the Easy 8, represented the pinnacle of American tank development. Wider tracks for better ground pressure, a more powerful engine, and most importantly, the high-velocity 76mm gun capable of threatening even the dreaded German Tiger. Mason walked around his assigned vehicle, inspecting every detail. The factory-fresh paint still gleamed despite the winter conditions. Inside, the turret layout was familiar but improved, with better ammunition stowage and more comfortable crew positions. It's beautiful, Williams declared, running his hand along the tank's hull. Detroit sent us their best. Mason thought of his father, who had helped build the earliest Shermans. How proud he would be to see his son commanding the latest version. As the crew familiarized themselves with their new mount, a jeep arrived carrying an airborne officer. The captain approached Mason, his jump boots and silver jump wings identifying him before he spoke. Captain James Winters, 82nd Airborne, he introduced himself. I'm told you're the tank commander who held Stumont. Mason shook the offered hand. Jack Mason, and it wasn't just me. My crew made it possible. Winters nodded respectfully toward the tankers. I've been instructed to guide you to our forward positions. The Germans are massing for another push, and we need your tanks in place before they move. Mason gathered his crew for a quick briefing. Mount up, we're moving to the front immediately. Within minutes, the 5 Sherman tanks were rolling north, following Winters' jeep along roads increasingly marked by combat. They passed columns of troops marching toward the front, artillery emplacements being dug in, and engineers constructing roadblocks. The 82nd Airborne's forward positions occupied a ridgeline overlooking a small river valley. Paratroopers had established foxholes and machine gun nests covering likely approach routes. Their distinctive M1942 jump jackets in calm, professional demeanor set them apart from regular infantry units. Winters led Mason to an observation post where a colonel stood studying the valley through binoculars. "Colonel Pearson, this is Captain Mason and his tank platoon," Winters announced. The airborne commander lowered his binoculars and assessed Mason with a quick glance. "You're younger than I expected for someone who's already becoming a legend." Mason felt uncomfortable with the characterization. "Just doing my job, sir." "Well, your job now is to help us stop whatever comes through that valley." Pearson handed him the binoculars. "Take a look. German activity about 3 miles east. They're assembling an armored force behind that ridgeline." Mason studied the distant terrain. Even at this range, he could discern vehicle movement and the distinctive silhouettes of German armor. Panthers primarily, but also heavier tanks. "Tigers," he identified, "at least 2 of them." Pearson nodded grimly. "That's our assessment as well. The 1st SS Panzer Division is bringing in their heaviest equipment for this push. They're determined to break through our lines." "Where do you want my tanks, sir?" Pearson indicated a map spread on a camp table. "I want 3 positioned here, covering the main road approach. The other 2 should deploy on this ridge where they can provide flanking fire. We'll have infantry, anti-tank teams supporting all positions." Mason studied the deployment plan. It was sound tactical thinking, maximizing their firepower while providing mutual support. The airborne commander knew his business. "We'll be in position within the hour, sir." As Mason returned to his tanks, he noticed Running Bear staring at the sky. Following his gaze, Mason saw breaks in the cloud cover. Blue patches were beginning to appear. "You were right," Mason acknowledged. "The weather is clearing." Running Bear nodded. "By midday, the sky will be open. The Thunderbirds will return." Mason smiled at the Navajo's reference to American fighter bombers. "Let's hope they're hungry for German tanks." The tank platoon deployed according to Colonel Pearson's plan, carefully positioning each Sherman for maximum effectiveness. Mason's tank occupied the central position overlooking the main road, its 76mm gun covering the most likely avenue of approach. Airborne soldiers visited the tanks, introducing themselves and establishing the rapport necessary for infantry armor cooperation. Unlike some infantry units that viewed tanks as merely mobile artillery, the paratroopers understood the combined arms concept. They discussed signals, support patterns, and contingency plans with professional thoroughness. By midday, as Running Bear had predicted, the cloud cover had dissipated entirely. A clear winter sky stretched above the battlefield, and within hours, the distant drone of aircraft engines announced the return of Allied air power. P-47 Thunderbolts flew overhead in attack formations, searching for German targets. "That's got to worry them," Williams commented, watching the fighter bombers patrol. "No more hiding their panzers under cloudy skies." The German response came in the form of increased activity behind their lines. Rather than abandoning their attack plans, they accelerated them. Before the Allied air forces could fully exploit the improved weather, the German armor began its advance. "Contact," Mason announced, spotting the 1st Panther emerging from the tree line. Multiple armored vehicles advancing in echelon formation. Colonel Pearson, who had established his command post near Mason's tank, observed the enemy deployment. "They're trying to get close enough that our aircraft will hesitate to bomb for fear of hitting our positions." It was a sound strategy. If the Germans could close the distance quickly, they might neutralize the Allied air advantage. "Hold fire until they reach the bridge," Pearson ordered. "Let them commit to the crossing." Mason relayed the command to his other tanks. The 5 Shermans sat motionless, guns trained on the approach routes, waiting for the enemy to enter their kill zone. The German advance was methodical and professional. Panthers in the lead, followed by infantry and half-tracks, with Tiger tanks providing heavy support from the rear. They moved with the confidence of elite troops who had prevailed in countless engagements. As the 1st Panthers reached the small bridge crossing the river, Colonel Pearson gave the order. "All units, fire!" The valley erupted in coordinated violence. 5 Sherman tanks fired simultaneously, their 76mm rounds streaking toward the German armor. The improved gun proved its worth immediately as 2 Panthers erupted in flames, their turrets thrown skyward by ammunition detonations. German return fire was immediate and precise. 88 8mm shells from the Tiger tanks struck near Mason's position, showering his Sherman with dirt and rock fragments. The airborne troops opened up with bazookas and machine guns, targeting the German infantry and lighter vehicles. "Target the engineering vehicle," Mason ordered Romano. "They're trying to establish a secondary crossing downstream." The gunner traversed their turret, acquiring the German bridge-laying vehicle attempting to span the river. One shot from the 76mm gun disabled it, leaving the partially extended bridge section hanging uselessly over the water. For the next hour, the battle raged across the valley. The Germans, committed to their assault, pushed forward despite mounting losses. American tanks and infantry held their ground, creating a defensive wall of fire that the attackers struggled to penetrate. The air support Mason had anticipated arrived in the form of P-47 Thunderbolts. The fighter bombers swooped low over the battlefield, rockets and 50 caliber machine guns striking German vehicles caught in the open. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical damage. German infantry, with no defense against air attack, sought cover wherever they could find it. Despite this advantage, the battle remained in doubt. German Tigers, with their superior armor, proved difficult to knock out even with the improved 76mm guns. One particularly effective Tiger had taken position behind a farmhouse, its 88mm gun picking off American targets while remaining partially protected. "We need to flank that Tiger," Mason told Pearson. "As long as it controls that sector, your men can't advance to secure the river line." The colonel considered the tactical problem. "Can your tanks make it around that eastern ridge without being spotted?" Mason studied the terrain. 2 tanks moving fast might make it. It's a risk. "Take it," Pearson decided. "I'll have my men provide covering fire to distract them." Mason selected his tank and one other for the flanking maneuver. He briefed Williams on the plan. "Full speed along that tree line. When we clear the ridge, immediate left turn and engage the Tiger from its rear quarter. Its armor is thinnest there." Williams nodded, his hands already adjusting the Sherman's controls. Just like dirt track racing, except with explosions. The 2 Shermans broke from their positions, engines roaring as they accelerated along the concealed route Mason had identified. German artillery attempted to track them, shells exploding in their wake, but the speed of their advance made accurate fire difficult. As they cleared the ridgeline, Mason spotted their target. The Tiger was still in position, its attention focused on the American lines across the valley. "Hard left," Mason ordered. Williams executed the turn perfectly, bringing their tank into firing position behind the German heavy tank. "Fire," Mason commanded. Romano didn't hesitate, sending a 76mm armor-piercing round directly into the Tiger's engine compartment. The German tank shuddered as the shell penetrated, igniting fuel and oil. Within seconds, flames engulfed the rear of the vehicle. The Tiger's crew attempted to traverse their turret to face this new threat, but a second shot from the other Sherman struck their turret ring, jamming the mechanism. Trapped in a burning vehicle with no means of returning fire, the German crew began bailing out through the hatches. Mason ordered his bow gunner to fire, the machine gun cutting down the escaping Germans before they could reach cover. In tank warfare, mercy was a luxury rarely afforded. These same SS tankers had executed American prisoners at Malmedy. With the elimination of the Tiger, the German attack lost momentum. American infantry pushed forward to secure the river line, while the remaining Sherman tanks provided covering fire from elevated positions. By late afternoon, the German force was in retreat, leaving dozens of burning vehicles across the valley floor. Colonel Pearson found Mason as the fighting subsided. "Outstanding work, Captain. That flanking maneuver broke their attack." Mason accepted the praise with a nod. "My crew deserves the credit, especially my driver. Not many could have executed that run under fire." "The 82nd doesn't forget those who fight alongside us," Pearson assured him. "Your platoon is now officially part of our task force. Where we go, you go." The attachment to the elite airborne division was both an honor and a challenge. The paratroopers were known for taking on the most difficult missions, often dropped behind enemy lines or thrust into the hottest sectors of the front. "We won't let you down, sir," Mason promised. As darkness fell, the Americans consolidated their gains and prepared defensive positions against potential counterattack. Mason's tank platoon established a Lager formation, vehicles in a circle for mutual protection, with maintenance and refueling conducted under blackout conditions. In the command tent, officers gathered for debriefing and planning. Intelligence reports indicated the German offensive was stalling across multiple sectors. The 1st SS Panzer Division had suffered significant losses in armor and personnel. Weather forecasts predicted continued clear skies, allowing Allied air superiority to hammer German supply lines. "We've weathered the worst of it," Colonel Pearson announced. "But Hitler has committed everything to this offensive. They'll keep coming until they've spent their last man and machine." Maps on the planning table showed the broader strategic picture. The German advance had created a massive bulge in the American lines, but had failed to reach its objectives. Now Allied forces were moving to counterattack, squeezing the bulge from multiple directions. "Our next objective is here," Pearson indicated a small town named Koop. "Intelligence believes the Germans are using it as a forward supply and maintenance base. We're going to take it." Mason studied the map. Koop was positioned at a critical road junction. Its capture would further disrupt German logistics. But something else caught his attention. Notes on the intelligence overlay mentioned maintenance facilities for heavy armor. "Tigers?" he asked. "At least one confirmed," the intelligence officer replied. "A Tiger Royal, their latest model, even more heavily armored than the standard Tiger." Mason felt a surge of both apprehension and excitement. The Tiger Royal, or King Tiger as Americans called it, represented the pinnacle of German tank design. Its 88mm gun could destroy any Allied tank at extreme ranges, while its frontal armor was nearly impervious to standard anti-tank weapons. "We'll need special tactics to deal with that," Mason noted. Colonel Pearson nodded. "That's why you're here, Captain. Your platoon will spearhead the attack on Koop with airborne infantry in support. If anyone can neutralize that King Tiger, it's your crew." The planning session continued late into the night. Every aspect of the operation was analyzed, contingencies developed, and resources allocated. The attack would commence at dawn, using the rising sun to blind German observers as American forces approached from the west. Mason returned to his tank after the briefing, finding his crew gathered around a small fire, the flames carefully shielded to prevent observation. They looked up expectantly as he approached. "Koop," he announced simply, "tomorrow morning, and there's a King Tiger waiting for us there." Williams whistled softly, the biggest cat in the jungle. "The toughest, certainly," Cohen corrected. "Frontal armor estimated at 150mm, sloped at 40 degrees, effectively immune to our 76mm gun from the front, even at point-blank range." Mason nodded. "Which means we don't hit it from the front. We'll need to outmaneuver it, target the sides or rear." "Or the tracks," Romano suggested. "Immobilize it, then find a vulnerable spot." "Exactly. Get some rest. Tomorrow we'll test everything we've learned." As the crew settled in, Mason remained by the fire studying the technical manual on the King Tiger that intelligence had provided. Every detail might prove critical in the coming engagement. The massive German tank represented the philosophical difference between American and German engineering. Where American tanks emphasized reliability, ease of production, and mobility, the Germans built mechanical monsters with overwhelming firepower and protection. In theory, one King Tiger could destroy an entire company of Shermans without suffering a scratch. But theory assumed perfect conditions and ignored the human element. Tanks were operated by men, and men made decisions based on training, experience, and emotion. Mason finally dozed off near dawn, the technical manual still open on his chest. He was awakened by Running Bear, always the first to rise. "Sky remains clear," the Navajo reported. "Good hunting weather." Mason nodded, gathering his equipment. "Let's hope so. We'll need every advantage today." The attack force assembled in pre-dawn darkness. 5 Sherman tanks supported by 2 companies of airborne infantry. The paratroopers loaded onto the tanks, using them as transportation for the initial approach. This improvised mechanized infantry would allow rapid movement until contact with the enemy. Mason issued final instructions to his platoon. "Standard wedge formation, my tank leads. Maintain 50-yard spacing, radio discipline until contact." At exactly 0600 hours, the force moved out. The Sherman's engines growled as they accelerated along the frost-hardened road toward Koop. Airborne troops clung to the tank hulls, their breath forming white clouds in the cold morning air. The sun rose behind them as they approached the town, exactly as planned. Any German observers looking westward would be blinded by the glare. Reconnaissance aircraft had reported minimal enemy activity, suggesting the Germans might be unaware of the impending attack. As they crested a small rise half a mile from Koop, Mason ordered a brief halt to survey the objective. Through his binoculars, he could see the town appeared lightly defended. A few vehicles moved in the streets, but no substantial forces were visible. "Looks quiet," Mason commented to Colonel Pearson, who had joined him for the final approach. "Too quiet," the airborne officer replied. "They must have sentries or observation posts we haven't spotted." Mason scanned the surrounding terrain more carefully. Something caught his eye. A glint of metal in the early sun, partially concealed in a copse of trees northeast of the town. There, he indicated. That could be our King Tiger. Pearson studied the position. Good eye, it's in overwatch position, covering the main approach road. The presence of the heavy tank complicated their assault plan. If they advanced along the main road, the King Tiger would have perfect firing positions against their column. We need to neutralize that tank before the main attack, Mason decided. Permission to take my tank on a flanking maneuver while the rest of the force remains concealed. Pearson considered the request. That's high risk, Captain. If you're spotted, you'll be alone against their heaviest armor. Risk is our business, Mason replied, and my crew is the best in the battalion. After a moment's consideration, Pearson nodded. Approved, but maintain radio contact. If the situation deteriorates, withdraw immediately. Mason returned to his Sherman, briefing his crew on the modified plan. We're going to circle wide to the south, then approach the Tiger Royal from its flank or rear. The rest of the force will hold position until we engage. Just us against a King Tiger? Cohen asked, his voice steady despite the implication. Just us, Mason confirmed. Any objections? Williams grinned. None from me, Captain. I've always wanted to dance with royalty. The Sherman pulled away from the main force, following a gully that provided concealment from the town. They moved slowly, minimizing dust and noise that might alert German observers. Mason directed Williams on a circuitous route that kept terrain features between them and the suspected Tiger position at all times. After 30 minutes of careful maneuvering, they approached their target from the southeast. Mason ordered a halt in a small wooded area that offered cover while allowing observation. Visual confirmation, he reported, studying the German tank through his periscope. King Tiger, number 332, appears to be in defensive position covering the northern approach to Coop. Through his magnified view, Mason could see the massive German tank partially concealed among trees. Its distinctive squared turret and long-barreled 88mm gun unmistakable. The tank appeared operational but stationary, possibly in a hull-down position that minimized its exposure while maximizing its field of fire. Crew activity? Romano asked, preparing for engagement. Mason adjusted his sight. Minimal. Commander's hatch is open, but I don't see personnel. They may be on stand-down status with just a watchkeeper. The tactical situation presented an unexpected opportunity. If the German crew was reduced or inattentive, they might achieve surprise. New plan, Mason announced. We position for a clear shot at their rear quarter, where armor is thinnest. On my command, Doc will put one round through their engine compartment. Immediately after, I'll fire a star shell above the tank. A star shell? Cohen questioned. That's an illumination round. Why? Psychology, Mason explained. If they think they're on fire, they might abandon the tank. These crews have seen too many of their comrades burn alive when ammunition cooks off. The crew nodded in understanding. German tank crews, like their American counterparts, lived in constant fear of fire. A tank hit in the right spot could become a crematorium in seconds. Williams maneuvered their Sherman into position with exceptional skill, using every fold in the terrain for concealment. They finally halted 200 yards from the King Tiger's rear, with a clear shot at its engine compartment. Target acquired, Romano reported, his eye pressed to the gun sight. Range 195 yards. Adjusting for elevation. Mason keyed his radio, informing Colonel Pearson they were in position. The airborne commander acknowledged, reporting the main force was ready to advance on his signal. Fire when ready, Mason ordered. Romano squeezed the trigger. The Sherman rocked backward as its 76mm gun discharged, sending an armor-piercing round directly toward the German tank's engine deck. The shell struck precisely where intended, penetrating the thinner rear armor and exploding inside the engine compartment. Immediately, Mason fired a star shell from his commander's pistol. The illumination round burst above the King Tiger, showering it with burning magnesium particles that created the illusion of a vehicle engulfed in flames. The psychological effect was immediate and dramatic. The King Tiger's hatches flew open, and German crewmen began bailing out in panic, believing their ammunition was about to detonate. 5 men emerged, scrambling away from what they thought was a doomed vehicle. Machine gun, Mason commanded. Running Bear opened fire with the bow machine gun, cutting down 3 of the fleeing Germans. 2 others sought cover behind their tank, returning fire with pistols. Shall I put another round in the tank? Romano asked, keeping his sight trained on the Tiger. Mason made a split-second decision. No, I'm going for capture. Capture? Williams echoed in disbelief. That tank is intact except for engine damage, Mason explained. Intelligence would give anything for an undamaged King Tiger to examine. He keyed his radio, informing Colonel Pearson of the situation. The airborne commander immediately grasped the significance, ordering his force to advance on coup while dispatching a squad to secure the German tank. Mason's crew maintained fire on the remaining German tankers, pinning them down until airborne troops arrived to capture them. Within minutes, American soldiers had secured the perimeter around the King Tiger. Mason exited his Sherman, approaching the captured German tank with professional curiosity. Despite being opponents, he couldn't help but admire the engineering. The King Tiger was a mechanical masterpiece, representing the pinnacle of German tank design. "Magnificent beast," he commented, running his hand along the thick armor plate of the turret. Williams joined him, examining the German tank with a mechanic's eye. "Look at the suspension system. And that gun, 88 millimeters of pure terror." Colonel Pearson arrived as they were inspecting the interior. "The town is secured, minimal resistance. Most of the Germans pulled out last night, leaving just a rear guard. And this beauty behind," Mason added, "Yatig," gesturing to the King Tiger, "a perfect specimen except for engine damage." "Intelligence will be ecstatic," Pearson agreed. "I've already radioed command. They're sending a recovery team." Mason climbed into the captured tank's commander's position, studying the controls and layout. Despite its fearsome reputation, the King Tiger had vulnerabilities. Its mechanical complexity made maintenance difficult, and its excessive weight strained engines and transmissions. A perfect metaphor for Germany itself, powerful but fundamentally unsustainable. "Can we get this thing running?" Williams asked, his mechanical curiosity piqued. "I'd love to see how it handles." "The recovery team will try," Pearson answered, "but our orders are to secure it in place for now." As American forces consolidated their hold on Coup, establishing defensive positions and processing the few prisoners taken, Mason received unexpected orders. He was to report immediately to Battalion HQ, bringing his initial assessment of the captured King Tiger. "You've done something remarkable here," Colonel Pearson told him as he prepared to depart. "That tank will provide invaluable intelligence on German capabilities." Mason nodded, though his thoughts were already turning to the next mission. The Battle of the Bulge continued, and much fighting remained before victory could be claimed. "We got lucky," he replied modestly. "Right place, right time, right decision." Pearson shook his head. "In combat, there's no such thing as luck. Only preparation meeting opportunity. Your crew was prepared, and you recognized the opportunity." As Mason returned to his Sherman, he found his crew already conducting maintenance, refueling, and restocking ammunition. Despite the success of their mission, they understood the war continued. Each battle was merely prelude to the next. "Where to, Captain?" Williams asked as Mason climbed back into his commander's position. "Battalion HQ first, then wherever they need us next." Mason checked his map. "The Germans are still in Belgium. Our job isn't finished." The Sherman's engine roared to life, its reliable power carrying them away from Coup and toward their next engagement. Behind them, the captured King Tiger stood silent. Its reign ended not by catastrophic destruction, but by American ingenuity and courage. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for weeks, but its outcome was now certain. The German gamble had failed. Hitler's last great offensive would become his final defeat in the West. And tanks like Mason's Sherman, despite being outmatched on paper, had proven that in warfare, the human element remained decisive. As they drove west, Running Bear looked skyward at contrails from Allied bombers heading toward Germany. "The enemy is retreating," he observed. "The tide has turned." Mason nodded, allowing himself a moment of cautious optimism. "One battle at a time, Chief. One battle at a time." But in his heart, he knew the Navajo was right. The tide had turned, not just in the Ardennes, but in the war itself. Victory now seemed not just possible, but inevitable. A victory purchased with blood, courage, and sacrifice by men from all corners of America. Men like his crew. Men like his father. Men who understood that freedom required defenders willing to face impossible odds with determination and ingenuity. The road ahead remained dangerous, but Jack Mason and his band of tankers would travel it together, writing their chapter in America's story one battle at a time. Battalion HQ, Belgium, December 23, 1944. The command center hummed with activity as Captain Jack Mason entered. Radio operators hunched over their equipment, intelligence officers marked maps with the latest frontline positions, and couriers moved between stations delivering updates from the field. In one corner, Colonel Marshall conferred with a group of officers around a large tactical display. Mason removed his helmet, still bearing the scars of recent combat, 4 days had passed since the capture of the King Tiger at Coup. 4 days of continuous operations with the 82nd Airborne, pushing back German forces across a 10-mile front. Colonel Marshall looked up from his planning table, noticing Mason's arrival. "The man of the hour," he called, gesturing Mason forward. "Gentlemen, this is Captain Mason, whose tank platoon captured that King Tiger intact." The assembled officers regarded Mason with newfound respect. Word of the achievement had spread quickly through command channels. A functional Tiger Royal represented an intelligence windfall of immense value. "It was a team effort, sir," Mason replied. "My crew deserves the credit." "Always modest," Marshall said with a knowing smile. "But the record will show your initiative made it possible." He turned to an officer Mason didn't recognize, a major wearing the insignia of military intelligence. "Major Sullivan has some questions about your assessment of the German tank." Sullivan extended his hand. "Impressive work, Captain. Our technical teams are en route to examine the vehicle, but your first-hand observations would be valuable." For the next hour, Mason detailed everything he'd noted about the King Tiger's construction, armament, and crew compartment. He sketched firing arcs, described armor thickness at various points, and explained vulnerable areas that American tankers might target. His lifetime of mechanical knowledge, combined with combat experience, provided insights that technical manuals couldn't capture. "One final question," Sullivan said as they concluded. "In your professional opinion, could American industry produce an equivalent tank?" Mason considered this carefully. "We could, but we shouldn't. The King Tiger represents a fundamental miscalculation. It's too heavy, too complex, too fuel-hungry. It breaks down constantly and can't cross many European bridges. Germany built the perfect tank for a war of quality. We're winning a war of quantity." Sullivan nodded thoughtfully. "Detroit mass production versus German craftsmanship." "Exactly. 5 Shermans against 1 Tiger. We might lose 3, but the other 2 will get the job done." Mason thought of his father, who had understood this philosophy perfectly. American tanks are built to win wars, not individual battles. After the debriefing concluded, Colonel Marshall took Mason aside. "New orders, Jack. Your platoon is being reassigned to spearhead operations against the Siegfried Line." The Siegfried Line, Germany's vaunted west wall, a network of bunkers, tank traps, and fortifications along its western border. Breaking through would mean fighting on German soil itself. "With the 82nd Airborne?" Mason asked. Marshall shook his head. "They're needed elsewhere. You'll be supporting the 2nd Infantry Division. They've been tasked with punching through near St. Vith." Mason studied the map Marshall indicated, noting the concentration of German defenses. "Heavy fortifications in that sector, sir." "The heaviest," Marshall confirmed. "That's why they need your tanks. The experience your crew gained fighting the SS makes you invaluable for this operation." Before departing, Mason requested permission to check on his men. He found them in the motor pool, performing maintenance on their tanks with characteristic thoroughness. Williams was adjusting track tension on Mason's Sherman, his hands blackened with grease despite the bitter cold. "How's she running, Texas?" Mason asked. Williams looked up, wiping his hands on an already filthy rag. "Transmission showing wear, but she'll hold." Chief replaced 2 road wheels on the left side. Cohen reorganized the ammunition stowage to improve loading times. Mason nodded with approval. These men understood that survival depended on mechanical reliability as much as combat skill. "New orders," he informed them. "We're moving to the Siegfried Line, supporting the 2nd Infantry Division near St. Vith." Romano emerged from beneath another tank. His medical kit opened beside him as he treated a minor injury for one of the newer crew members. "The west wall, that's going to be a tough nut to crack." "That's why they're sending us," Mason replied. "Rotation schedule remains the same. Everyone gets 6 hours sleep before we move out at 0000. As Mason conducted final inspections, Cohen approached with a letter. "Mail came through, Captain. This one's for you." Mason recognized Eleanor's handwriting immediately. He tucked the envelope inside his jacket to read later, in private. A piece of home to be savored away from the chaos of war. That night, while his men slept in rotation, Mason sat in the turret of his Sherman reading Eleanor's letter by flashlight. She wrote of Detroit in winter, of her work at the tank plant, of neighborhood news that seemed impossibly distant from the reality of Belgium. The final paragraph caught his throat. "I see your father in every tank that leaves the factory. His attention to detail, his insistence on quality in every weld and rivet. The foreman says production is up 30%, but safety incidents are down. Your father's legacy lives on here. Come home safe, Jack. There's a place for you in Detroit when this is finished. Mason carefully refolded the letter, returning it to its envelope. Home seemed an abstract concept now, a distant shore glimpsed across an ocean of violence and destruction. But Eleanor's words had rekindled something he'd nearly forgotten: the possibility of life after war. The approach to the Siegfried Line took 2 days of difficult travel through terrain devastated by combat. Burned-out vehicles littered roadsides, both American and German. Villages stood empty, their inhabitants fled or hiding in cellars. The winter landscape, beautiful in peacetime, had become a monochrome canvas of destruction. Mason's tank platoon, now expanded to 7 Shermans, with the addition of replacement vehicles, traveled in combat formation. The men remained vigilant despite being behind friendly lines. German commando teams in American uniforms had been active during the Bulge offensive, and no one took security for granted. They reached the assembly area near St. Vith as darkness fell on December 26th. The town itself remained a contested ruin, its strategic road junction making it valuable to both sides. American forces had established a perimeter on its western edge, preparing for the push toward the German border. Colonel Harris of the 2nd Infantry Division greeted Mason at the command post, a farmhouse remarkably untouched by the surrounding destruction. Maps covered every surface, showing the German defensive positions with formidable clarity. "The Siegfried Line runs here," Harris indicated, tracing a finger along contour lines representing forested ridges. Concrete bunkers, anti-tank ditches, minefields. The Germans have had 4 years to perfect these defenses. Mason studied the terrain. "And our breach point?" Harris pointed to a narrow valley. "Here, the defenses appear thinner. Reconnaissance suggests it might be a weak spot in their line." "Or a trap," Mason observed, "channeling our armor into a kill zone." Harris nodded grimly. "That possibility has been considered. That's why your tanks will advance with infantry in close support. Each Sherman will have a squad assigned specifically to protect it from close-in threats." The assault was scheduled for dawn. As Mason returned to his platoon to issue orders, he found his crew gathered around a small fire, passing a canteen of coffee that somehow remained hot despite the freezing temperature. "7 tanks against the west wall," Williams commented when Mason outlined their mission. "Those odds seem familiar." "Better than 3 against a Panzer Division," Romano replied, cleaning the optical sights for their gun with meticulous care. Mason spread a map on the Sherman's hull, illuminating it with a shielded flashlight. "We'll advance in staggered formation. Alpha section takes the lead with infantry forward. Bravo section provides covering fire from these elevated positions. My tank will coordinate between sections." Cohen studied the map intently. "Those bunkers will have interlocking fields of fire. One tank stopped means the entire advance stalls." "Which is why we don't stop," Mason emphasized. "Continuous movement is our only advantage. We keep moving, we stay alive." Running Bear had been unusually silent, even for him. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of premonition. "This ground has seen much death. It will see more tomorrow." The men fell quiet, each contemplating the Navajo's words. None disputed their truth. Dawn arrived with mist clinging to the valley floor, providing some concealment for the American advance. Mason stood in his tank's turret, binoculars trained on the ridgelines ahead, where German bunkers lay hidden among trees and earthworks. Nothing moved in the pre-dawn stillness, but he felt the weight of watching eyes. "All units, prepare to advance," he ordered over the radio. "Infantry forward. Tanks maintain 50-yard intervals. Gunners, target any visible bunker apertures." The column moved out, Sherman engines growling in the morning air. Ahead, infantry squads spread out in loose formation, probing for mines and hidden obstacles. Mason kept his tank in the center position, where he could observe and direct the entire formation. They had covered half of the distance to the first line of defenses when the valley erupted in coordinated fire. Machine gun positions, expertly camouflaged on both ridgelines, opened up on the advancing Americans. Mortar rounds began falling with increasing accuracy as German forward observers adjusted their fire. "Target 2 o'clock machine gun nest," Mason directed. Romano traversed the turret, acquiring the target through his sight. "On target. Fire." The Sherman's 76mm gun roared, sending a high-explosive round directly into the German position. The machine gun fell silent, but others continued their deadly crossfire. "All tanks, target identified machine gun positions," Mason ordered. "Infantry, push forward to those rock formations for cover." The battle for the Siegfried Line developed into a brutal test of wills. German defenses, layered in depth and mutually supporting, exacted a steady toll on the attacking Americans. Yet the advance continued yard by yard, bunker by bunker, through determination and coordinated action. By mid-morning, they had breached the first defensive line, creating a narrow salient into the German position. But the cost had been high. Two Shermans disabled by mines, another with a thrown track from rough terrain. Casualties among the infantry mounted as they cleared trenches and foxholes with grenades and bayonets. Mason directed his remaining tanks into firing positions, covering the next phase of the advance. Through his periscope, he could see a massive concrete bunker commanding the approach to the second line. Its reinforced walls, likely 10 feet thick, would shrug off direct hits from their 76mm guns. "We need air support," he radioed to the command post. "Heavy bunker at coordinates Hotel 37. Request fighter-bomber strike." The response came back immediately. "Air support unavailable. Weather at base is zero visibility. You're on your own." Mason considered their options. Direct assault would be suicidal. Bypassing the bunker would leave a dangerous strong point behind their lines. "Bring me the infantry captain," he ordered Running Bear. Captain Reynolds arrived minutes later, his uniform caked with mud, face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. "What's the plan for that monster?" he asked, nodding toward the bunker. "I'm thinking shaped charge," Mason replied. "If we can get engineers close enough to place explosives on the gun port, we might be able to direct the blast inward." Reynolds considered this. Suicide mission in daylight. They've got perfect fields of fire. Not if we give them something else to worry about. Mason outlined his plan, a coordinated attack using tanks as distraction, while a small engineer team approached from an unexpected direction. The operation commenced an hour later. 3 Shermans moved into exposed positions, firing continuously at the bunker's apertures. Unable to damage the structure, they nonetheless forced the defenders to close armored shutters and restricted their visibility. Meanwhile, an engineer squad, led by a lieutenant named Parker, worked their way along a drainage ditch, approaching the bunker from its right flank. They carried satchel charges specifically designed for bunker penetration. Mason watched the operation unfold, directing tank fire to respond to any German reaction. When German mortars began targeting the exposed Shermans, he ordered evasive movement while maintaining fire on the bunker. The engineers reached the bunker's blind spot, placing their charges against the gun port's metal frame. After setting timers, they retreated to safe distance. The resulting explosion focused its energy inward, bypassing the concrete protection and devastating the bunker's interior. As smoke cleared, American infantry rushed forward, securing the position before German reinforcements could respond. Inside, they found the devastating effectiveness of the shaped charge. The bunker, designed to withstand artillery bombardment, had been defeated by American ingenuity. "One down," Reynolds commented as he rejoined Mason. "About 50 more to go." The advance continued with the same methodical determination. By nightfall, American forces had penetrated 2 miles into the Siegfried Line, creating a bridgehead that subsequent attacks could exploit. The cost had been grievous. 3 tanks destroyed, 2 more damaged beyond field repair, and infantry casualties approaching 30%. Mason's crew had survived intact, though their Sherman bore the scars of combat. Shell impacts had scarred its armor, 1 antenna had been shot away, and the right track showed damage from mine fragments. Williams and Cohen worked through the night making repairs, ensuring they would be operational for the next day's push. In the command tent, Mason reported to Colonel Harris. The infantry commander studied the map with satisfaction, despite the day's losses. "We've created our penetration," Harris noted. "Tomorrow we exploit it, push through to this road junction, then swing north to roll up their flank. My remaining tanks will need infantry support," Mason reminded him. "We're down to 4 operational vehicles." "You'll have it. I'm committing my reserve company to support your advance." As Mason departed, Harris added, "The division commander has forwarded a commendation for your actions today. That bunker was the linchpin of their defense in this sector." Mason acknowledged the praise with a nod, though personal recognition meant little compared to the lives of his men. He returned to his tank, finding his crew had established a small perimeter around their vehicles. Running Bear handed him a canteen of hot coffee, somehow procured despite the battlefield conditions. "Tomorrow will be harder," the Navajo said simply. Mason didn't dispute this assessment. The Germans would reinforce, counterattack, do everything possible to seal the breach in their vaunted Siegfried Line. "Get some rest," he told his crew. 2-hour rotations. I'll take first watch." From his position atop the Sherman, Mason surveyed the battlefield. Flares occasionally illuminated the landscape, revealing a terrain transformed by violence. Craters pockmarked the valley floor. Disabled vehicles stood like monuments to failed advance or retreat, and the forms of the fallen lay where they had dropped. Recovery deemed too dangerous until the position was secured. In the distance, he could see German activity, vehicles moving behind their lines, presumably bringing reinforcements. Tomorrow's battle would be fought against fresh troops, not the battered defenders they had pushed back today. Mason checked his watch. 4 hours until dawn when the advance would continue. 4 hours for his men to rest, repair, rearm. The war's arithmetic was merciless. Hours of preparation for minutes of combat, endless work for fleeting advantage. Dawn arrived with artillery. German guns, positioned well behind their lines, delivered a barrage of stunning intensity. The entire American position disappeared under eruptions of earth and smoke as shells found their range with devastating accuracy. "Take cover," Mason ordered, though the command was largely symbolic. There was little protection to be found against such bombardment except inside their tanks or in hastily dug foxholes. The barrage continued for 20 minutes, then lifted suddenly. In the ringing silence that followed, Mason heard the unmistakable sound of German tank engines. "Counterattack," he announced over the radio. "All tanks, combat positions. Infantry, prepare for armor assault." Through the drifting smoke, German Panthers appeared, advancing in echelon formation with infantry support. Mason counted at least 8 tanks, accompanied by several self-propelled guns, a formidable force committed to sealing the breach Americans had created. "Target lead tank," Mason ordered Romano. "Armor piercing." The gunner had already acquired the target. "On target. Fire." The Sherman's gun hammered, sending its round downrange with lethal accuracy. The shell struck the lead Panther at the junction of hull and turret, penetrating its armor and igniting ammunition stored inside. The German tank erupted in flames, its turret thrown skyward by the catastrophic explosion. The battle developed with chaotic intensity. 4 American Shermans against 7 remaining Panthers, with infantry on both sides engaging in their own deadly contest. Mason directed his tanks to use terrain features for protection, employing hit-and-run tactics rather than direct confrontation with the superior German armor. "Keep moving," he reminded his crews. "Fire and reposition. Don't give them a stationary target." The strategy proved effective. The Sherman's mobility, combined with crew experience, allowed them to inflict damage while minimizing their exposure. 2 more Panthers were disabled by well-placed shots, while another fell victim to an infantry team with a bazooka. But the Germans pressed their numerical advantage. A Panther round struck the Sherman adjacent to Mason's, penetrating its side armor. The American tank shuddered, then erupted in flames. Only 2 crewmen escaped the inferno. "We're down to 3 tanks," Running Bear reported, maintaining his composure despite the deteriorating situation. Mason made a quick tactical assessment. The German attack had stalled, but not broken. With equal losses on both sides, the mathematical advantage remained with the defenders. They needed to change the equation. "New plan," he decided. "We withdraw to the ridgeline, establish overwatch positions, draw their tanks forward into prepared infantry positions." The maneuver resembled retreat, which Mason knew might concern higher command, but tactically it would separate German armor from their infantry support and expose them to concealed American anti-tank teams. As the 3 remaining Shermans pulled back, German tanks pursued cautiously, suspecting a trap but unable to ignore the apparent American withdrawal. When the Panthers reached the valley floor, American infantry emerged from concealed positions, attacking with bazookas and satchel charges. 2 more Panthers fell to these attacks. Another, damaged by a bazooka round that immobilized it, became a stationary target for Mason's tank. Romano put a round directly through its frontal armor, the improved 76mm gun proving its worth against Germany's best. The German counterattack faltered, then collapsed. Surviving Panthers withdrew, covered by smoke grenades and the remnants of their infantry. The breach in the Siegfried line had held, though at tremendous cost to both attackers and defenders. Colonel Harris found Mason surveying the battlefield from atop his Sherman. "That withdrawal was a gamble," the infantry commander observed, his tone neutral. "A calculated risk," Mason replied. "Their tanks were pushing us back regardless. This way we controlled the terms of engagement." Harris nodded slowly. "It worked. Division confirms the Germans are pulling back to their secondary positions. We've officially breached the Siegfried Line. The news should have brought elation, but Mason felt only grim satisfaction. The breach had cost too many lives to celebrate. An entire surface mine now occupied what had been pristine forest. The town nearby had been reduced to rubble, never to be rebuilt. Over the next 3 days, American forces expanded their penetration of the German defenses, pushing several miles beyond the former Siegfried Line. Mason's depleted tank platoon, reinforced with 2 replacement vehicles, provided mobile fire support for infantry clearing operations. On December 30th, they reached the Roer River, a natural barrier the Germans had transformed into their next defensive position. Mason halted his column on high ground overlooking the river valley, immediately recognizing the tactical problem they faced. They flooded the valley, he observed to Colonel Harris, who had come forward to assess the situation. The river's at least twice its normal width. Harris studied the terrain through binoculars. Intelligence warned this might happen. They've destroyed dams upstream to create a water barrier. The flooded zone extended nearly 2 miles on their side of the river. Any approach would require traversing this waterlogged ground, where tanks would bog down and infantry would be exposed without cover. "We can't cross here," Mason stated flatly. "Not without amphibious vehicles and extensive engineer support." Harris lowered his binoculars. "Division agrees. We're establishing defensive positions and waiting for the water to recede. Could take weeks. The Germans will use that time to reinforce the far bank." "No doubt, but our artillery can make that difficult for them." The American forces dug in along the heights overlooking the flooded Roer Valley. Mason positioned his tanks at strategic overlooks where their guns could cover potential crossing points. For the first time since the Battle of the Bulge began, they had entered a period of relative stability. The static position allowed for a rotation of forces. Crews received their first hot meals in weeks. Mail arrived from home, bringing news and reminders of the world beyond the battlefield. Replacement parts reached the maintenance teams, allowing proper repairs to battle-damaged vehicles. Mason used the time to reorganize his platoon. Replacement crews needed integration into their combat methodology. New tanks required modification to match veteran crews' preferences. Every lesson learned in combat was transmitted to these newcomers, improving their chances of survival. On January 2, 1945, Colonel Marshall arrived at their position, bringing unexpected orders. Mason was summoned to a planning meeting in a farmhouse serving as temporary headquarters. "We're being reassigned," Marshall informed him, indicating a map showing a position far to the north of their current location. "Soviet forces are advancing rapidly in the east. High Command wants us to establish blocking positions here, preventing German forces from moving troops to counter the Russian offensive." Mason studied the map with surprise. "That's nearly at the Baltic." "Correct. We'll be the northern anchor of the Allied line, making sure the Germans can't shift their reserves eastward." The strategic implications were significant. The war was entering its final phase, with Soviet forces driving toward Berlin from the east, while American and British armies pushed from the west and south. Germany was being squeezed in a vice of Allied power. "When do we move out?" Mason asked. "Tomorrow. Your platoon will spearhead our advance, with the battalion following in echelon." The journey north took 5 days, moving through liberated territory where the scars of occupation remained visible in destroyed villages and wary civilians. They passed columns of German prisoners being marched to rear areas, defeated men in tattered uniforms who barely glanced at the American tanks. They reached their assigned sector on January 8th, establishing positions overlooking a lake that formed part of the natural boundary with German-held territory. Across this narrow body of water, Soviet forces had established their own positions, creating a bizarre situation where American and Russian troops could observe each other despite being nominally allies. Mason studied the Soviet positions through his binoculars. Red Army soldiers moved with the confidence of forces who knew victory was inevitable. Their equipment, much of it American supplied through Lend-Lease, appeared well-maintained despite the rigors of their long advance from Stalingrad. "Keep an eye on those positions," Mason instructed his tank commanders during a briefing. "The Russians are allies, but there's no coordination between our forces at this level. Maintain normal security protocols." The warning proved prescient. That night, Running Bear, manning the radio watch, received a transmission in broken English requesting a meeting between American and Soviet officers. Mason, concerned about security, insisted on strict protocols for the encounter. The meeting occurred at dawn on neutral ground between their positions. Mason represented the American forces, accompanied by Williams as driver and Running Bear as interpreter. The Soviet delegation consisted of a captain and 2 sergeants. their winter uniforms bearing the decorations of combat veterans from the Eastern Front. Captain Masov, the Russian officer, introduced himself, extending a gloved hand. "Third Guards Tank Army, we are pleased to meet our American allies at last." Mason shook the offered hand. Captain Mason's 740th Tank Battalion were similarly pleased. The coincidental similarity of their names brought smiles to both delegations. Through Running Bear's careful translation, they exchanged information about their respective positions and missions. "We both prevent Germans from moving troops," Masov explained. "You block westward movement, we block eastward. Together we create trap." The logic was sound. Their combined presence would ensure German forces remained fragmented, unable to concentrate for effective defense or counterattack. As the meeting concluded, Masov offered Mason a flask of vodka. "To victory, American comrade." Mason accepted a small sip, returning the gesture with an offer of American coffee, which the Russians accepted with enthusiasm. The exchange, though minor, represented the tentative alliance between democracies and Soviet communism, united temporarily against fascism. The cordial meeting gave way to a more complex reality in subsequent days. Soviet and American forces maintained their respective positions, but interaction remained minimal and characterized by mutual suspicion. German artillery occasionally shelled both sides, apparently hoping to create discord between the uneasy allies. On January 15th, Mason witnessed a disturbing incident that foreshadowed future tensions. An American sergeant passing a Soviet checkpoint while delivering messages casually greeted a Russian sentry with, "Hi, Ruski." The Soviet guard, whether from misunderstanding or genuine hostility, opened fire, killing the American instantly. When Mason reported this to Colonel Marshall, the battalion commander's response was grim. "This won't be the last incident, T. The Russians don't operate by our rules, and they're already thinking about the post-war world." "Sir, the world after Hitler, Mason, the Soviets aren't fighting for democracy. They're fighting for Soviet power. Once Germany falls, we'll be facing a new adversary across Europe." The prediction proved accurate. As January progressed, relations with their Soviet counterparts deteriorated. Russian officers became less communicative, more suspicious. Security around their positions intensified, with additional guard posts established facing American lines rather than German territory. Mason's tank platoon maintained its assigned mission, preventing German forces from shifting eastward. But increasingly, they found themselves watching Soviet movements as carefully as German ones. The Cold War was beginning while the Hot War still raged. On February 3rd, the strategic situation changed again. With Soviet forces advancing rapidly toward Berlin, the American sector was deemed secure enough to withdraw mobile forces for deployment elsewhere. Mason's platoon received orders to join the American occupation zone in western Germany. Their new assignment attached them to the 3rd Infantry Division, tasked with maintaining order in recently captured German territory. The contrast between combat operations and occupation duty was stark. Instead of engaging enemy forces, they now patrolled villages and towns, enforcing curfews, preventing looting, and establishing the American presence. Mason found this transition challenging. His men were trained for mobile warfare, not policing civilians. Yet he recognized the importance of their role in the war's final phase. How occupation was handled would shape Europe's future for generations. Their headquarters established in a small town near Frankfurt, Mason organized his platoon into rotating patrol units. Each tank operated with infantry support, conducting daily movements through assigned sectors. Their presence alone deterred most trouble, though occasional incidents required intervention. On April 12th, news reached them that President Roosevelt had died. The impact on American forces was profound. For most soldiers, Roosevelt had been the only president they had known as adults, the voice of American resolve through depression and war. "What happens now?" Williams asked as the platoon gathered to discuss the news. "We continue our mission," Mason answered firmly. "The president is gone, but America continues. Vice President Truman takes over. The war effort doesn't change." But change was accelerating across Europe. Hitler committed suicide on April 30th as Soviet forces entered Berlin. German units began surrendering en masse to Western Allied forces, preferring American captivity to Soviet. The Third Reich collapsed with surprising speed once its center failed. On May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was officially over. Mason gathered his crew beside their Sherman, now bearing the scars of campaigns from Belgium to Germany. "It's done," he told them simply, "at least this part." "What happens to us now, Captain?" Cohen asked. The question carried multiple layers of meaning. What happened to their unit, to their individual futures, to the world they had fought to reshape? Some of us will go to the Pacific, Mason replied honestly. Japan still fights. Others will remain here for occupation duty. Eventually, we all go home. Home. The concept had become abstract during years of war. Mason had left Detroit a boy of 17. He would return a man of 20, carrying experiences most civilians could never comprehend. In the months that followed, the 740th Tank Battalion was gradually deactivated as part of the massive demobilization of American forces. Crews with sufficient points based on time served and combat experience were rotated home. Others were reassigned to occupation duties or prepared for deployment to the Pacific. Mason, despite his youth, had accumulated enough points for discharge by August 1945. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought Japan's surrender, eliminating the need for a Pacific deployment. His war had ended. Before departing Belgium, he visited the battlefield at Stumont one last time. The small Belgian town was rebuilding, though evidence of combat remained visible in pockmarked buildings and the occasional burnout vehicle not yet removed. At the railway station where his platoon had first engaged German tanks, Mason stood in contemplative silence. So much had changed since that desperate morning in December 1944. The world had been transformed, millions had died, and power relationships between nations had fundamentally shifted. His reverie was interrupted by an elderly Belgian man who approached cautiously. "You are American soldier?" he asked in accented English. "Yes," Mason confirmed. "I was here during the battle." The man's expression brightened. "You are with tanks? The ones who stopped Germans here?" Mason nodded, surprised by the recognition. "My daughter," the man continued. "She have baby during fighting. American soldier help her reach hospital." "Williams?" Mason recalled immediately. "Corporal Williams from my crew." "Yes, this man. My daughter named boy after him. Samuel." The Belgian's eyes shone with emotion. "You tell him?" "Tell him boy is strong, healthy, named for American who showed kindness during war." Mason promised to deliver the message, though he knew Williams had already rotated home to Texas. The connection between actions during war and their ripple effects through peacetime struck him forcefully. Amid the destruction, life continued. Children born during conflict would grow up in a world shaped by sacrifices made before they could comprehend them. Fort Knox, Kentucky, 1975. Colonel Jack Mason, retired, walked slowly through the newly expanded Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armor. At 59, his hair had grayed completely, and his posture showed the cumulative impact of injuries sustained during his military career. But his eyes remained sharp, observing the displayed vehicles with a tanker's practiced assessment. He paused before a massive German tank, its angular turret and long-barreled 88mm gun still projecting menace despite decades of peace. A King Tiger, immaculately restored and sectioned to show its internal components. Beside it stood an informational plaque. Mason leaned forward, reading the text with growing disbelief and anger. According to the display, the tank had been captured by the 423rd Ordnance Evacuation Company during the Battle of the Bulge. There was no mention of the 740th Tank Battalion or the crew who had actually disabled and secured the vehicle. "Excuse me," he called to a young lieutenant serving as museum guide. "This information is incorrect." The officer approached with professional courtesy. "Sir, this tank wasn't captured by the 423rd Ordnance. It was taken by the 740th Tank Battalion. I know because I was there." The lieutenant looked uncomfortable. "Sir, our historical records indicate—" "Your records are wrong," Mason interrupted firmly. "Tank number 332 was disabled by Sergeant Romano's gunfire and secured by my platoon near Coupe, Belgium. The 423rd arrived after the action to transport it." "I'll make a note of your concerns," the lieutenant offered diplomatically. Mason recognized the dismissal in the young officer's tone. Another aging veteran with fading memories, perhaps confused about events 30 years past. But Mason knew with absolute certainty what had occurred. "Who's in charge of historical accuracy here?" he demanded. The confrontation eventually led him to the museum curator's office. A civilian historian with academic credentials but no military experience. The curator listened to Mason's account with polite skepticism. "Colonel, while I appreciate your perspective, we base our exhibitions on official documentation. The 423rd Ordnance Company has been credited with this capture since 1945. Because they painted their name on the tank and claimed credit." Mason replied, his frustration evident. My gunner disabled that vehicle. My crew secured it. History should reflect what actually happened, not what someone painted on the hull. The curator made non-committal noises about reviewing the documentation, but Mason recognized institutional inertia when he encountered it. Changing the official record would require more than one veteran's testimony. Over the next year, Mason conducted a personal campaign to correct the historical record. He traced members of his former crew, gathering sworn statements about the King Tiger's capture. He researched military archives, finding combat reports that corroborated their account. He even located photographs showing the tank before the 423rd painted their identification on its turret. His persistence eventually reached a sympathetic ear in the Pentagon's historical division. A full review was ordered, comparing all available documentation. Finally, in 1907, the museum's display was updated with a corrected account, properly crediting the 740th Tank Battalion with the capture of Tiger Royal 332. For Mason, the victory was bittersweet. Romano had passed away the previous year, never seeing their contribution officially recognized. Williams lived on a ranch in Texas, too ill with emphysema to travel to Kentucky for the updated display's unveiling. But the truth had been established, preserving not just historical accuracy, but the legacy of men who had faced death to secure that prize of war. It mattered. History mattered. The stories told about conflict shaped how future generations understood sacrifice and courage. Belgium, 2004. The tour bus pulled into Stumont's renovated town square, disgorging American visitors into the bright summer sunshine. Most were family members of veterans, participating in a 60th anniversary tour of Battle of the Bulge sites. Among them, walking with the assistance of a cane, 88-year-old Jack Mason observed how completely the town had transformed since his last visit. Modern buildings had replaced those damaged in the fighting. The railway station had been rebuilt and expanded. Only a small monument in the square acknowledged the desperate battle that had occurred here 6 decades earlier. Mason separated from the tour group, making his way slowly towards St. Edward's Sanatorium on the hill overlooking the town. The building had been fully restored after the war, serving as a medical facility until the 1980s, then converted to a museum and cultural center. As he approached the entrance, a woman in her early 60s emerged from the building. She studied him with sudden recognition. "You are American veteran, yes?" she asked in accented but clear English. Mason nodded. "I fought here, December 1940. "With tanks?" she pressed, her expression intensifying. Again, Mason nodded, surprised by her interest. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "My mother was here, in basement. She was pregnant. I was born during battle." Mason's breath caught. "Jacques, you're the baby born in the cellar?" "Jacqueline," she corrected with a smile. "My mother always said American tank soldiers protected them, that without you, we would not have survived." She took his hand in both of hers. "Thank you for my life, for all our lives." Mason found himself unable to speak, overcome by the connection across time. The desperate battle for St. Edward's, fought by exhausted men pushed to their limits, had created this moment 6 decades later. A life preserved, a generation continued, a future secured. "Would you like to see inside?" Jacqueline offered. "I am director of the Cultural Center now." Mason accepted gratefully. As they toured the building, he recognized spaces transformed by time and renovation. The lobby where they had established defensive positions now housed art exhibitions. The corridors where men had fought and died displayed historical photographs and artifacts from the region's past. In the basement, Jacqueline showed him a small exhibition dedicated to the battle. Photographs, maps, and personal accounts documented the American defense of the building and the civilians sheltered within. Mason was stunned to find his own name mentioned, along with those of his crew. "How did you research this?" he asked. "My mother kept in touch with your medic, Dr. Romano," she explained. "He visited several times after the war, and the priest, Father Matthias, maintained detailed records of everyone sheltered here." The preservation of this history, the connection between past and present, affected Mason deeply. His actions as a young man had rippled through time in ways he could never have anticipated. The war, for all its horror, had created bonds that transcended national boundaries in decades. That evening at a reception for visiting veterans, Mason found himself surrounded by Belgians eager to express gratitude. Children and grandchildren of those who had experienced the war firsthand sought connections to their own history through these aging Americans. An elderly man approached with a much younger companion. Captain Mason, he greeted formally. Samuel Williams, named for your driver who helped my mother reach hospital during battle. Mason shook the offered hand, remembering the Belgian who had approached him in 1945. Your grandfather told me about you just after the war ended. He asked me to tell Williams. And did you? The younger man asked. Yes, it meant a great deal to him. Mason smiled at the memory. He always said that was the most important thing he did during the war. Not the tanks he destroyed or the battles he fought, but getting your grandmother to safety. As the reception continued, Mason found a quiet corner to observe the interactions between former enemies and allies. Belgians, Americans, and even Germans now in their 70s and 80s, united by shared history despite having experienced it from different perspectives. Running Bear's words from 60 years earlier echoed in his memory. This ground has seen much death. True enough. But it had also seen survival, renewal, and now reconciliation. Perhaps that was victory's true meaning. Mason's reflections were interrupted by a young historian who had been recording veterans' accounts for an oral history project. Colonel Mason, I wanted to ask about the King Tiger incident, the historian began. The one you fought to have properly documented. Mason nodded, pleased that even this aspect of his war experience was remembered. What made you pursue that correction so determinedly? The historian asked. Many veterans simply accepted historical inaccuracies. Mason considered the question carefully. Because truth matters, he answered finally. Not for pride or recognition, but because those who come after us deserve accuracy. My gunner, Romano, deserved to have his shot remembered correctly. My driver, Williams, deserved credit for his courage. Running Bear, Cohen, all of them. The historical record is our only permanence. The young historian nodded thoughtfully. And looking back now, after all these years, what stands out most about your wartime experience? The men, Mason replied without hesitation. Not the tanks or the battles or the strategies. The men who fought together, who trusted each other with their lives. Different backgrounds, different beliefs, united by common purpose. That's what America sent to Europe. Not just machines and ammunition, but its sons, in all their diversity and determination. As the reception wound down, Mason stepped outside into the Belgian evening. The peaceful countryside, once torn by shell craters and tank tracks, now showed no visible scars from that desperate winter of 1944. Nature and human resilience had healed the landscape. Mason thought of Detroit, where his journey had begun, of his father working on early Sherman tanks, instilling a love of mechanics and purpose, of Eleanor, who had waited for his return and shared his life for 47 years before cancer took her, of their children and grandchildren, who knew his war experiences only through carefully edited stories that omitted the worst horrors. The cycle continued. New generations inherited the world shaped by those who came before, often unaware of the decisions and sacrifices that created their reality. Perhaps that was as it should be. The purpose of sacrifice was to create a future where such sacrifice became unnecessary. Mason looked up at stars unchanged since soldiers on both sides had navigated by them 6 decades earlier. The same constellations had guided men through the darkness of conflict, a reminder that some things remain constant despite human violence. We did what we could, he whispered to absent comrades. We held the line. And in the end, that had been enough. Not perfect, not without want, but enough to preserve the possibility of something better for those who followed. The tank commander from Detroit had become part of something larger than himself, a collective effort that had altered history's course. As he turned to rejoin the gathering, Mason carried the weight of memories, but also their sustaining power. The Steel commander had fought his battles, preserved his crew, and lived to see the world they had helped create. In the balance of a life, that represented victory indeed.